Hello everyone, hope you're doing right. Today we're talking about the Infiltration Shadow for all you sneaky Jedi who want to do a bunch of burst damage. Let's dive right into it. Brief disclaimer as usual, I'm not an expert on this stuff. I'm just a nerd. I play a lot of SWTOR. I kind of know what I'm doing, but if there's anything that I miss, you can feel free to leave them down in the comments below and help out your fellow players. I'm sure they would appreciate it. All right. For your tertiary stats, accuracy in PvE, 110% every single time. It's very important, but in PvP, you can kind of dump all your accuracy. You don't really need it. For your alacrity, 7.2% alacrity, and you should be ready to go. And then throw everything else into crit. Crit is very important to us in this spec, so everything else, dump it into crit. Speaking of crit, for our tactical, Blade of the Elements, probably the most important tactical for us. It's going to give us essentially auto crits on Vaulting Slash every single time we use it. It's very, very nice. If you're in like ranked PvP, you can use 2 Cloaked, but for everyone else, just take Blade of the Elements. It's just a whole bunch of damage. We love to see it. For our legendaries, Force Training Package, a flat 3% extra damage. It's pretty darn boring, but it's kind of the best that we got. Next, we take Dynamic Force, which is going to give us more Force Potencies, reduces cooldown in 15 seconds. Again, pretty boring. Pretty darn boring, but it's just the best in the row. Combat Styles, Energizing Blade, very important. It's going to be resetting our Vaulting Slash all the time. Take it. It's fantastic. We love to see it. Force Wave, very obnoxious root knockback. Take it. It's awesome. Vision Engine is going to be building stacks of crit up to 20% extra crit. And in a world where everyone has like a flat 35% base crit, we can bump this up to like 55% base crit. That's a lot of damage. Take this pretty much every single time. Farsighted Instrument is going to help out with your force management. It's pretty nice. Additionally, it's going to give you that little bit of healing, so you'll be healing yourself for like 1k HPS. So, Beast Poke in the eye, it's okay. You know, not great, not terrible. It is what it is, but the force management is where it's at. Intangible Spirit is AoE DR, great in almost all forms of content. Occasionally, some people will take like Sturdiness in PvP to avoid getting stunned more, but for the most part, the AoE DR is just out of this world. Force Phase is essentially a root break every time you use our Force Speed or Shadow Stride. It's very nice in PvP. Some players in PvE will take Kinetic Surge for the extra movement speed, and then if you're AoE farming, you can take Lambast for the extra damage of Whirling Blow. It's kind of up to you, but for the most part, I like the root break and mobility provided by Force Phase and Kinetic Surge. Resilience and Force Lift are the two options here. Resilience for the extra DCD, Force Lift for the extra CC. That's defensive cooldown and crowd control. You can kind of take either one you want to. I like Resilience more. I just find it to be more useful. But if you want to have the Force Lift, you think it's fun, by all means take it. And then you can cut Cleaving Cut out of your life entirely. Finally, Cloak Resilience is going to give you that 2 seconds of resilience after you use Force Cloak. It essentially purges all your dots. That way you can get out of combat much easier in PvP. It's a great way to be avoiding damage as well in PvE. So you can stealth out and get that Force Resilience and then hopefully avoid a lot of that force tech damage. Some people would take Stalker Swiftness. There are some fights where this is actually pretty good. It's kind of up to you, but for the most part, Cloak Resilience is just where it's at. But that's all the boring stuff. Let's talk about actually doing damage. If you learn nothing else from this entire discussion, remember this. You're going to keep 2 stacks of Clairvoyance on the target at all times. Clairvoyance is this buff right here of it has 2 stacks right now. It's a little green guy holding a lightsaber like this. Keep 2 stacks up at all times. If you let these 2 stacks fall off, you're throwing, all right? This is giving us an extra 20% crit chance, which is just phenomenal. That's all the damage in the world, and we need it for some of our other abilities as well. So keep that 20% of crit chance up by using Clairvoyance all the time. Now, there are 2 ways to build Clairvoyance stacks. The first is by using Whirling Blow. Whirling Blow is our AoE ability. We can use it out of combat. People will use this before we get into combat to make sure that we have these 2 stacks right away. However, if we read the fine print on our buff here, Vision Engine will only give us 20% crit chance when we use it with our Clairvoyant Strike, which is our second way of building these stacks. So the first way is with Whirling Blow. The second way is with Clairvoyant Strike, which will give us the extra crit chance. This seems like an oversight to me. I'm assuming they'll eventually include Whirling Blow in that little utility. But for right now, just know Clairvoyant Strikes will give you that 20% crit chance as well as keeping this very important buff on the target. We'll talk about why it's important later. Essentially, free damage. Free damage, free damage, free damage. This most important ability that we have. You have 15 seconds to keep Clairvoyance on the target. Please, please, please Do not let Clairvoyance fall off. If you let Clairvoyance fall off, I'm benching you to Serenity because you can't handle Infiltration, all right? So please keep Clairvoyance on the target at all times. It's the most important buff we have in our tray. But it doesn't do a whole bunch of damage. You can see here it hits the target like twice. It does like 20,000 damage. That's kind of boring. Let's talk about actually doing big boy damage by following this very basic priority system here. You can see there's a lot of glowing buttons. We'll talk about them all. Just know that you can basically play all this spec by following these 5 buttons in the order that they're currently in. So let's talk about them, shall we? The first and most important ability in our rotation here is going to be Vaulting Slash. Vaulting Slash is only usable after a critical hit. However, it does a whole bunch of damage because of our tactical, meaning that every time you have 2 stacks of Clairvoyance, there it is again, use Clairvoyance, keep 2 Clairvoyance stacks up at all time, we will have a 100% crit chance on Vaulting Slash. It's very, very nice. It does like 40 to 50k damage. It's pretty darn fantastic. However, you're going to notice here that it has a relatively long cooldown. It has like a 15-second cooldown. That's kind of sad. I want to be smashing Vaulting Slash as often as possible because it does a whole bunch of damage, and that's a lot of fun. How can we be getting more Vaulting Slashes? Well, I'm glad you asked me. If you remember, back in the old days, we took down here Energized Blade, which means that every time you crit with a force attack, you will get your Vaulting Slash back. Which is why you can see again, keeping that 20% crit chance with Clairvoyance up is very important because every time that we crit with a force ability, you will get your Vaulting Slash back. So instead of waiting that full 15 seconds, you can just wait like 1 second and get lucky with a force crit and then get that Vaulting Slash back. And so again, if I haven't beat this into your head enough, keep Clairvoyance up at all times. Please, por favor. It's very, very important. So, by critting with any force ability, we will get your Vaulting Slash back. Now, this does include our primary damaging force abilities, but that also includes abilities like Force Stun. If you crit with Force Stun, you get Vaulting Slash back, congratulations. You can use Force Slow and get Vaulting Slash back, congratulations. You can use Slow Slash and get Vaulting Slash back, assuming that it crits. So there are a lot of ways to get these Vaulting Slashes back, but for right now, all you need to know is that when it's available, hit it as often as possible. It's going to crit and do a whole bunch of damage. Smash it. All right, like you smash that like and subscribe buttons on every single one of my videos, you should definitely be smashing Vaulting Slash 24/7 whenever it's available. Let's talk about the next ability here, which is called Force Breach. Force Breach's damage is based on how many Breaching Shadows we have. Breaching Shadow is the second buff that we really need to be paying attention to here. When we hit 3 stacks of this Breaching Shadows, Force Breach will start to glow, and then it does a whole bunch of damage, and hopefully it'll crit, and hopefully it'll give us back our Vaulting Slash, etc., etc. So we want to build up to 3 stacks of these Breaching Shadows to hit these massive Force Breaches. But how do we build these stacks of Breaching Shadows? Well, I'm glad you asked me. Every single time you do a melee ability, there is a 50% chance you will build a stack of Breaching Shadows. That's available once every 6 seconds. So assuming everything goes right, you'll get your 3 stacks over the course of the next 18 seconds, which is that's a pretty long while to wait between building up to 3 stacks of these Breaching Shadows, right? We want to be building those a little bit faster. Well, fortunately, we're not just relying on doing melee damage and slowly building these stacks of Force Breach, because every time you have 2 stacks of Clairvoyance, have I not made it clear enough, have 2 stacks of Clairvoyance up at all time, every time you use our Psychoblast, we will also generate 1 stack of Force Breach. You can see here if I spend all my stacks, and then I have my Clairvoyance up, and use a Psychoblast, I will automatically generate 1 stack of Force Breach. Now, because Psychoblast's cooldown is relatively short, that means you get our Force Breaches back very, very quickly, assuming you have your 2 stacks of Clairvoyance up. Have I not made this clear enough yet? Keep your 2 stacks of Clairvoyance up at all time, por favor. So, let's talk about other ways to generate 3 stacks, though, because like we can rely on just like RNG blessing us with doing our regular melee attacks and then using our Psychoblast and then getting our Force Breach out there. Like, that's okay and all. But there are other ways we can build 3 stacks of our Force Breach. The first of which is our Force Potency. Force Potency gives you 3 auto crits on all your force attacks, which if you're paying attention at home means you can do something crazy like auto crit into vaulting slash into auto crit into vaulting slash into auto crit into vaulting slash, etc., etc., etc. for those back-to-back-to-back mega crits. Just throwing it out there. But additionally, Force Potency also gives you 3 stacks of Force Breach. So every time you hit the Force Potency button, you're going to see that Force Breach is going to start to glow because you're going to have 3 stacks, which you can go and use to your heart's content with the big fat Force Breach. Hi, Future Bigs here. I forgot to mention this in the video. I might have actually been completely wrong. If you use Force Potency, you're going to get all your crits right in a row. So you're going to use Force Potency, get all these massive crit chances. I actually don't have my gear on right now, so my crit chance isn't at 100%. But you're going to get your crit chance, your crit chance, your crit chance. Love to see it, love to see it, love to see it. And then if you use your Force Cloak, your Force Potency cooldown is reduced by a minute, which when combined with our gear and our legendaries are going to be reducing the cooldown of Force Potency, means that you can pretty much go back to back to back Force Potencies by just popping that Force Cloak. So even when you're doing PvE content, if you pop Force Cloak and you stealth out, it'll reduce your cooldown of Force Potency by a minute, which means that you're going to get a lot of crits back to back to back to back to back, which means you can get those vaulting slashes over and over and over again. Hopefully that clarifies things and is an extra way to get those fat 3 stacks of Force Breach. Additionally, we can use this ability here called Shadow Stride. Shadow Stride is our leap, essentially, where it will bring us over to the target, boop, and then will instantly generate 3 stacks of Force Breach. It has a relatively long cooldown. It has like a 30-second cooldown. However, it's a great way for us to be building those 3 stacks of Breaching Shadows, so that way we can hit those big, fat Force Breaches. Let's recap that really quick to make sure we're all on the same page. The first way to generate our stacks of Breaching Shadows is just by doing melee damage. If we have 2 stacks of Clairvoyance up, every single Psycho Blast will generate 1 stack of Breaching Shadows. Additionally, we can have auto crits from Force Potency, and that will automatically generate 3 stacks of Breaching Shadows, which we can use Force Breach. And finally, if we use our Shadow Stride, that will also generate 3 stacks of Force Breach, which we can use, do a bunch of damage. Those are the primary ways that we could be generating our big Breaching Shadows for the big, fat, glowing Force Breach. We only want to be using Force Breach when it's at 3 stacks. Anything else is pretty much a waste of time. So those are the 2 most important abilities: Vaulting Slash, big damage, crits all the time; Force Breach when we have our 3 stacks. Let's talk now about Psycho Blast. Psycho Blast, again, if we have our 2 stacks up, will always generate a stack of Force Breach, which is why it's very important to us. Additionally, it does a fair bit of damage on its own, and it has a chance to reset our Vaulting Slash, assuming that we crit with it and get lucky. It is the 3rd most important ability to us. It's a very good time. It also has a very short cooldown, which means that we can be building these 3 stacks of Force Breach relatively quickly because it only has like a 5-second cooldown, which combined with our melee proccing of Force Breach means that every 2 Psycho Blasts will get essentially a Force Breach. It is the 3rd most important ability. Assuming that we have our 2 Clairvoyant stacks up, it's very, very nice. It does a whole bunch of damage pretty much for free. You're going to notice here that this spec is very crit dependent. Sometimes you're not going to get lucky, because the idea with this spec right now is that we want to be going from like Vaulting Slash into like a crit cycle, which is going to give us back into a Vaulting Slash, which you can use a Force Breach, etc., etc., etc. It's in a perfect world, you'd be doing crit and then Vaulting Slash and then crit and then Vaulting Slash and then crit and then Vaulting Slash. But sometimes you just get unlucky. Like you can see right now, I'm not critting with any of my Force abilities, so I'm not getting my Vaulting Slashes back. That sometimes just happens. What you can do about this is just get luckier. That's not a meme. Just get luckier. There's nothing you can do. Sometimes this spec will be very frustrating and will not reward you with any of the big crits, and sometimes you'll go back to back to back to back to back with all the crits in the world. It kind of is what it is. Just get luckier, kid. Sorry. Finally, our filler ability here is going to be our Shadow Strike. Shadow Strike, when used from behind the target, does a whole bunch of damage, like 23,000 damage. Additionally, every 10 seconds, you will get this little buff here called Infiltration Tactics, which is going to mean our Shadow Strike does more damage and consumes less force. Normally, on its own, Shadow Strike will consume a boatload of force. However, when it's glowing, it consumes less force. and does more damage, which is pretty darn nice. Additionally, with Infiltration and all shadows, Force Management is pretty darn easy. It's just a flat regeneration. If you mess it up and you run out of force, like just wait for like a second, it'll fix itself. So it's pretty much our final filler ability. So how do these abilities all work together? Well, as we mentioned previously, Clairvoyant Strike is nice on its own, like it does okay damage, but its most important use is to be keeping up our 2 stacks of Clairvoyant Strike. If you are not rebuilding Clairvoyant Strike, we fill with essentially these 4 abilities as they are glowing. Vaulting Strike, the most important ability of them all. Followed by Force Breach, which you can only use when you have 3 stacks. Followed by Psychoblast, which we use to build stacks for our Force Breach. And then you can essentially just fill with Shadow Strike from there, and you should be ready to rock and roll. From there, we just basically follow this priority system all the way down. So the most important ability, Vaulting Slash, and then work our way down the target here over and over and over again, filling to make sure that we are keeping our stacks of Clairvoyance up, and then just essentially hitting the glowing buttons as they are available to us in this little priority tree here. And that's really all there is to it. Like, I wish there was more I could be talking about here, but there's really not. Essentially, just hit the most important abilities from down the tree here. Try to be proccing your Clairvoyant Strikes as often as possible, and that's really it. The skill from this spec comes from trying to manage and automatically build the extra stacks of our Force Breach through like Force Potency and through our Shadow Strike. So what you can do, for example, is you can go like Force Breach into Vaulting Slash into Potency to Breach to Slash to Shadow Stride to Breach to Slash, and then like auto crit all those times in a row thanks to our Force Potency. There's a lot of good ways we can be building extra stacks or auto critting on our Vaulting Slash just by kind of spamming that Force Potency and making sure we are making the most of those auto crits on our force attacks. And then from there, just get lucky. Like, just pray to God that you get those massive auto crits on your force abilities. If you don't, that's fine. You know, it is what it is. Get better next time. That's all there really is to it. Oh, additionally, I forgot to mention this. Shadow Strike sunders the target, so it has, less armor. Just more reasons why this is a great ability. Now you may be asking to yourself, Biggs, what about that Spinning Strike ability that is supposed to do a whole bunch of damage to targets below 30% health? Frankly, Shadow Strike does more damage. Just flat out does more damage. And so anytime you could be using a Spinning Strike, the Shadow Strike is better. So the top players, you'll notice, just completely abandon Spinning Strike from their game, which is kind of sad, but it is what it is. Use Shadow Strike instead. It's pretty much just better. Additionally, what about all these other buffs that I should be paying attention to? Like, what about that kinetic field? What's that? The circling shadows? What about? Okay, I need you to listen to me very closely. Unless it's Breaching Shadows, unless it's 2 stacks of Clairvoyance, 2 words. Who cares? Who cares? The rest of the buffs happen passively. It's like Force Regeneration. It's going to give you a little extra crit chance. It's going to leave you a little extra bit of DR. You don't have to pay attention to them. They'll happen passively as you do your rotation here. The only thing you need to worry about is keeping up those stacks of Clairvoyance and then working down this very simple rotation here. Essentially just hit the glowing buttons as they order, as they appear. Vaulting Slash, most important. Breach Winds Glowing, second most important. Psychoblast, third most important. And then just fill the Shadow Strike and you should be ready to rock and roll. Let's briefly talk about defensive cooldowns here while we're at it. Deflection gives you a flat 50% melee and range defense chance, which is going to give you a chance to avoid all incoming damage. It's only a chance though; it's not defense or it's not damage reduction. So, again, you got to get lucky. This is kind of like the spec of rolling dice. It's either going to work out great or it's going to work out terribly. Resilience, I take it all the time. It's going to resist all force tech damage, but if there's any white damage, so force tech is yellow damage. If you see on the target, all the damage here that's white is weapon damage. Any damage that is yellow is force damage, so it avoids all yellow damage, which is very, very nice. Additionally, we have a lot of crowd control in this spec. We have our Force Slow, which will slow the target for 50% for 6 seconds. It's available every 10 seconds. It's very, very nice. Additionally, we have our Force Wave, which knocks everyone back and then roots them for an obnoxious amount of time. It's very, very nice. Additionally, we have our Low Slash, which is a 30-meter stun, which is kind of crazy. You can use it all the way across the room. It's very nice. You can see that these are also force attacks, so they have a chance to proc our Vaulting Slash, which is, pretty darn nice. And finally, we have our Force Stun, which is just going to stun the target for 4 seconds. Again, all the CC in the world because of this spec. It's very, very nice. We also have taunts in this spec, so single target mind control. Never touch this in PvE. You can touch it all the time in PvP. It's going to make players do less damage to your friends. It's very, very nice. Additionally, mass mind control is our threat drop in PvE, and then in PvP, it just makes all players do 30% less damage to anyone other than you. So it's a great way to kind of spam earn those protection medals. It's a nice little ability. That's kind of all I have for this conversation here. Again, 2 stacks Clairvoyant, you should be ready to rock and roll. Then follow this very basic priority system and you will be rocking and rolling, doing all that burst damage. I will pray to RNGesus for you for your massive procs on Vaulting Slash. We pray every day for Vaulting Slash procs. I think that's all I have. Pretty sure. Yeah. Okay. Like, comment, subscribe, or don't. You do whatever you want. All right, it's a free country. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You take care now. Ta-ta.